The day began like any other. I, Alex, was sifting through my mail, separating the bills from the junk, when a peculiar envelope caught my eye. It was made of a thick, velvety paper, the kind you'd associate with a wedding invitation. But what was printed on it was far from matrimonial. You are cordially invited to the performance of a lifetime, the Symphony of Screams. I chuckled. As a music journalist, I've received my fair share of flamboyant invitations, but this one was particularly theatrical. The details were sparse. An old, abandoned theater on the city's outskirts, a date, and a time. No RSVP, no contact information. Curiosity piqued, I did a quick online search. Nothing. No social media buzz, no event listings, not even a whisper among my contacts in the music industry. It was as if this event existed solely in the confines of the ornate card I held. The mystery was tantalizing. I imagined how it would feel to write about an exclusive event, one that no one else had access to. The potential acclaim, the boost to my reputation, it was too good to pass up. As the day wore on, my reservations faded. The allure of the unknown, the potential for a unique story, proved irresistible. I decided I would attend this mysterious concert. Little did I know, it would be a decision I'd come to regret. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the city in a dusky glow, I dressed in my best concert attire and made my way to the old theater. The weight of anticipation hung heavy in the air, and I could feel the thrum of excitement coursing through my veins. But as I approached the venue, a sense of unease began to creep in. The theater, long forgotten by the city, stood like a relic of a bygone era. Its once grand facade now weathered and worn, windows boarded up, and the entrance shrouded in shadows. I hesitated for a moment, the eerie silence amplifying my doubts. But the thought of the story I could tell, the acclaim it could bring, pushed me forward. Taking a deep breath, I stepped into the unknown, unaware of the horrors that awaited me inside. The dim lighting inside the theater cast eerie shadows on the walls, and the once red velvet seats were now faded and torn. The place smelled of dampness and decay, but it was the audience that unsettled me the most. They sat in their seats, rigid, their eyes fixed on the stage, their expressions blank. It was as if they were in some sort of trance. I took a seat in the back, trying to blend in, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The anticipation in the room was palpable, and a hush fell over the audience as the lights dimmed further. The curtains slowly drew back, revealing an orchestra set up in a semicircle. But this was no ordinary orchestra. The instruments looked off. They were grotesque amalgamations of wood, metal, and flesh. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The music reached a crescendo, the screams and instruments blending into a cacophony of horror. As the final note echoed through the theater, the audience erupted into applause, their faces still devoid of emotion. I stood frozen in place, my mind racing, trying to process the nightmare I had just witnessed. The conductor, his back to the audience, slowly turned to face me. His eyes, cold and calculating, bore into mine. He began to walk towards me, each step deliberate and measured. The audience's applause grew louder, drowning out my racing heartbeat. "Ah, Alex," he said, his voice smooth and chilling. "I've been waiting for you." I tried to speak, to demand answers, but my voice failed me. He continued, "You see, every masterpiece needs its final touch, and you, my dear, are the missing piece to my symphony." He gestured for me to follow him, and though every instinct screamed at me to run, I felt compelled to obey. He led me backstage, and the horrors I had imagined paled in comparison to the reality. The room was filled with instruments of torture, each more grotesque than the last. People, or what was left of them, were bound to tables, their mouths gagged, their eyes pleading for release. The maestro, as he called himself, walked over to a table where a man was strapped down, his chest exposed. With a swift motion, the maestro plunged a knife into the man's chest, expertly removing his heart, which he then placed inside a wooden box that emitted a haunting melody. "The heart," he whispered, "is the purest instrument. Its beats, its rhythms, they tell a story. And when combined with the agony of the soul, it creates the most exquisite music." I felt bile rise in my throat, the weight of the situation pressing down on me. "Why?" I managed to choke out. "Why are you doing this?" He looked at me, a hint of amusement in his eyes. For the music, of course. True art requires sacrifice, and what greater sacrifice than one's very soul? He moved closer, his face inches from mine. And now, Alex, it's your turn to be a part of my masterpiece. Desperation surged through me. I had to find a way out, to escape this madman's clutches. But as I looked around, I realized that escape might not be possible. The maestro had orchestrated this night perfectly, and I was just another pawn in his twisted game. The performance began with a soft, haunting melody. The music was beautiful, ethereal even, but there was an underlying tone of dread. As the composition progressed, I began to hear something else, a faint, distant scream. I looked around, trying to locate the source, but the audience remained motionless, entranced by the performance. The screams grew louder, more distinct, and I realized with growing horror that they were coming from the instruments themselves. The string section played bows across taut human sinews, the wind instruments crafted from hollowed-out bones, and the percussion section. I shuddered as I saw human heads, mouths agape in silent screams, being used as drums. Panic surged through me. I had to get out. I rose from my seat, but as I did, the music reached a fever pitch, and the screams became deafening. I rushed to the exit, but the doors wouldn't budge. They were locked from the outside. I turned back to the stage, my heart pounding in my chest. The conductor, a tall, slender figure dressed in a tattered tuxedo, locked eyes with me. His gaze was cold, predatory. He raised his baton, and the orchestra played with renewed fervor. The audience began to chant in unison, their voices monotone and lifeless. The symphony of screams, the music of the soul. Over and over, the words echoed through the theater, each repetition amplifying my terror. I was trapped, a prisoner in this nightmarish concert, and I had the sinking feeling that the final act was about to begin. The maestro's cold laughter echoed in the room as he prepared his instruments. My heart raced, and my mind raced even faster, searching for a way out. My eyes darted around the room, and they landed on a broken record, its jagged edge glinting in the dim light. Without thinking, I lunged for it, gripping the sharp shard and swinging it at one of the maestro's assistants who was approaching me. The shard cut deep into his arm, and he screamed in pain, dropping his tools. The maestro turned in surprise, his eyes filled with rage. Seizing the moment, I bolted towards the stage exit. The maestro shouted orders to his other assistants, and I could hear their footsteps pounding behind me. I pushed through a heavy curtain, finding myself in a narrow corridor filled with old props and costumes. The smell of gasoline was strong, and I realized that the theater's old infrastructure was a fire hazard. In my panic, I knocked over a lantern, and the flames quickly caught onto the old wooden structures. The fire spread rapidly, consuming everything in its path. The heat was intense, and the smoke made it hard to breathe, but the fear of being caught by the maestro and his minions drove me forward. I finally found an emergency exit, the door slightly ajar. With all my strength, I pushed it open and stumbled out into the cool night air, gasping for breath. Behind me, the theater was engulfed in flames, the fire roaring and crackling, accompanied by the distant screams of the maestro's symphony. I ran as far as my legs would carry me, not stopping until I reached the safety of my apartment. Collapsing on my couch, the weight of the night's events crashed down on me. I had escaped with my life, but the trauma of what I had witnessed would stay with me forever. Days turned into weeks, and the memory of that night haunted my every waking moment. The police had investigated the fire, and the remains of the maestro and his assistants were found among the ashes. The theater was a total loss, and the city mourned the loss of a historic landmark. But for me, the real horror was just beginning. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the haunting melodies of the maestro's symphony. And every time I listened to music, no matter how beautiful or uplifting, I could hear the distant screams of his victims, forever reminding me of the price of my survival. The city never slept, and neither did the downtown diner where I worked. My name's Lena, and I've been a waitress here for the past 3 years. The neon lights outside painted a perpetual twilight inside, and the chime of the entrance bell became the soundtrack of my life. Regulars came and went, each with their stories, their quirks. But lately, something had been off. It began subtly. Jake, a middle-aged man with a persistent cough, always ordered black coffee and sat by the window. He'd been coming in every Tuesday and Thursday for as long as I could remember. But one day, he just stopped. I didn't think much of it until Sarah, a college student who'd often complain about her ankle's slight limp, also vanished. "Have you seen Sarah lately?" I asked my colleague, Rita, one evening. She shrugged. "People come and go, Lena. Maybe she found a new spot." But it wasn't just Sarah. More of my regulars, my friends, began disappearing. Each had mentioned some minor ailment during our small talks. A stiff neck, a sore wrist, a bad knee. It was as if they were being picked off one by one. One evening, as I wiped down the counters, the diner's old TV, which always played the local news, caught my attention. The headline read, "Mysterious Bodies Found Across the City." The reporter spoke of bodies discovered in public places, parks, alleys, even a library. The images were too graphic for TV, but the reporter's description sent chills down my spine. Each body had been operated on, crude incisions made, and then stitched back haphazardly. I felt a knot in my stomach. The details were too coincidental. Each of my missing friends had a minor physical complaint, and now this? Bodies with evidence of unsanctioned surgeries? I tried to shake off the paranoia. Maybe I was connecting dots that weren't there. But deep down, an unsettling feeling grew. Something sinister was happening in our city, and my friends were its victims. That night, as I locked up the diner, every shadow made me jump, every distant noise made my heart race. The city's usual hum now sounded like a haunting lullaby, luring its next victim into the hands of the one they called the midnight surgeon. The diner's bell chimed, signaling the end of another late-night shift. The streets outside were quiet, with only the distant hum of city life echoing through the alleyways. As I stepped out, pulling my jacket tighter against the cold, a voice broke the silence. "You have such a unique beauty, you know?" I turned to find a tall man, his features obscured by the dim streetlights. His eyes, however, were piercingly clear, studying me intently. "Thank you," I replied cautiously, trying to keep my voice steady. "Is there something you need?" He stepped closer, his gaze never leaving mine. "It's just that nose of yours. Slightly crooked. It's charming." Feeling a shiver run down my spine, I quickly brushed off his comment. "Have a good night," I said, hurrying away. The man's laughter echoed behind me, but I didn't dare look back. The next morning, I was jolted awake by a frantic call from Rita. "Lena, turn on the news. Now." The local news channel showed a familiar park, now cordoned off with police tape. The reporter spoke in hushed tones. "Another victim of the so-called midnight surgeon was found early this morning. The victim's identity is yet to be confirmed, but sources say." The camera panned to a body, covered with a white sheet. But what made my heart stop was the sight of a familiar necklace peeking out from under the sheet, a necklace I had gifted to my friend Emily on her birthday. The reporter continued, "Preliminary reports suggest the victim's skull was crudely opened, possibly while she was still alive." I felt sick. Emily had been complaining of migraines for weeks. And now, she was the latest victim of this monstrous killer. The events of the previous night flashed before my eyes, the mysterious man, his comment about my nose, his unsettling laughter. Could he be the midnight surgeon? The timing was too coincidental. Throughout the day, I felt like I was being watched. Every shadow, every whisper seemed to hint at a lurking danger. The diner felt suffocating, each customer a potential threat. That evening, as I was locking up, I found a note tucked under the diner's door. Scrawled in messy handwriting, it read, "Your beauty is unique, but it can be perfected. Await your turn." The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. The man from the previous night was the midnight surgeon, and I was his next target. The weight of the situation bore down on me, but I knew I couldn't let fear paralyze me. I had to act, and fast. The days following the discovery of Emily's body were a blur. My once beloved diner, a place of comfort and familiarity, now felt like a trap. Every time the bell above the door chimed, My heart raced, fearing it might be him, the midnight surgeon. One particularly quiet evening, the bell rang, and in he walked. The same man who had commented on my nose. His presence was suffocating, his eyes cold and calculating. He took a seat at the counter, his gaze never leaving mine. "Evening," he said, his voice dripping with faux cheerfulness. "I hope you've been thinking about our last conversation." Swallowing my fear, I approached him, trying to keep my voice steady. "What do you want?" He leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I told you, I want to perfect beauty. And you, my dear, are next on my list." My mind raced. I needed to keep him talking, to gather as much information as possible. "Why are you doing this? Why hurt innocent people?" He chuckled, a sound devoid of any warmth. "Innocent? No one is truly innocent. Everyone has flaws, imperfections. I merely help them achieve their true potential." The weight of his words hit me. This man truly believed he was doing a service, that his twisted surgeries were a gift. I needed to alert the police, but how? He was watching my every move. Feigning calm, I said, "I need to get something from the back. Will you be all right here for a moment?" He smirked, "Of course. But remember, I have eyes everywhere." Rushing to the kitchen, I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, quickly explaining the situation in hushed tones. The operator assured me officers were on their way. I just had to stall. Returning to the counter, I tried to engage him in conversation, asking about his work and his patients. He spoke with pride, detailing his procedures with a sickening glee. The minutes felt like hours, but finally, the distant sound of sirens reached my ears. His face darkened, realizing the game was up. "You think they can stop me?" he hissed, rising from his seat. "You're just one in a long line of projects. They'll never catch me." As the police cars pulled up, he slipped out the back door, disappearing into the night. The officers searched the area but found no trace of him. I was safe, for now. But the knowledge that the midnight surgeon was still out there, watching, waiting, haunted my every waking moment. The days following my confrontation with the midnight surgeon were a haze of paranoia. Every shadow, every unexpected noise sent my heart racing. I knew he was still out there, and I was his unfinished project. One evening, as I was locking up the diner, a sharp pain pierced the back of my neck. The world around me blurred, and I felt my knees buckle. The last thing I remember before everything went black was the cold, mocking laughter of the surgeon. I awoke to the sterile smell of disinfectant, my body strapped to a cold metal table. The dim light above flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The room was filled with the chilling sound of surgical tools clinking together. "You're awake," a voice cooed. The midnight surgeon emerged from the shadows, his face obscured by a surgical mask. "I've been waiting for this moment. You're going to be my masterpiece." Tears streamed down my face as I struggled against my restraints. "Why are you doing this?" I choked out. He leaned in close, his breath cold against my ear. "Perfection, my dear. I'm going to fix you." As he reached for a scalpel, a sudden crash echoed through the room. The door burst open, revealing a SWAT team with guns drawn. The surgeon's eyes widened in surprise, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. Taking advantage of the distraction, I summoned all my strength and managed to break free from one of the restraints. Grabbing a nearby scalpel, I lunged at the surgeon, slashing his arm. He cried out in pain, dropping his weapon. The SWAT team quickly subdued him, but not before he managed to slip away, disappearing into the labyrinthine corridors of his lair. I was rescued, but the trauma of the ordeal left deep scars. The midnight surgeon was never caught, and his shadow loomed large over my life. Every time I found myself in a quiet place, the haunting sound of surgical tools echoed in my ears, a constant reminder of the horror I had endured. The story of the midnight surgeon became the stuff of urban legends, but for me, it was all too real. And somewhere out there, he was still waiting, ready to claim his next victim. The rain was relentless, each drop a stinging reminder of that fateful night. The night I lost everything. My wife, my daughter, both taken from me by a monster I couldn't catch. Every time I closed my eyes, their faces haunted me, urging me to find justice. I was pulled from my thoughts by the blaring of my police radio. All units, we have a 10 to 54 at 5th and Elm. Possible homicide. I grabbed my coat and rushed to my car. The scene was only a few blocks from the precinct. As I approached, the flashing blue and red lights painted an eerie picture against the backdrop of the old town square. I could see a crowd had gathered, their faces a mix of horror and curiosity. Pushing through the police tape, I was met with a sight that sent chills down my spine. A body, positioned in the center of the square, like a grotesque puppet on display. Strings were attached to each limb, pulling them in unnatural directions. The face, frozen in a silent scream, was someone I recognized. It was Mike, a regular at the diner where I often grabbed my morning coffee. Just yesterday, he'd been joking about his upcoming fishing trip. Detective Martinez approached, his face pale. "James, have you ever seen anything like this?" I shook my head, trying to process the scene. "No, but whoever did this wanted us to find it. This is a message." Martinez handed me a note found near the body. Scrawled in jagged handwriting, it read, "The shadows guide my hand, making the imperfect perfect." The weight of my past pressed down on me. Another killer, another game. But this time, it felt personal. The positioning, the note, it was as if this killer knew about my past, about the family I'd lost. I clenched my fists, determination burning in my eyes. "We're going to catch this bastard, Martinez. No more innocent lives will be lost on my watch." As I left the crime scene, the memories of my family's laughter echoed in my mind, a stark contrast to the horror I'd just witnessed. This case wasn't just about justice, it was about redemption. I was determined to stop this Shadows puppet before he struck again. The city was gripped by fear. Each morning brought the discovery of a new victim, posed grotesquely like a puppet, strings attached to their lifeless limbs. The media had dubbed the killer the Shadows puppet, a name that sent shivers down the spines of the city's residents. James pored over the case files late into the night, photographs of the victims spread out before him. The pattern was clear, all the murders occurred under the cover of darkness, and each victim was found in a location that held significance to their past, a childhood home, a school, a former workplace. It was as if the killer was forcing them to confront their past before ending their lives. The memories of his own family's brutal murder weighed heavily on James. He had been unable to protect them then, but he was determined not to let this new killer continue his reign of terror. One evening, after hours of research, James stumbled upon a potential lead. He noticed that several of the victims had items missing from their person, a locket, a ring, a photograph. These weren't random thefts, they were personal, intimate items. It was as if the killer was taking a trophy, a memento of his gruesome act. Determined to find a connection, James delved deeper into the backgrounds of the victims. He discovered that many of them had attended the same local events in the past month, a charity ball, a theater performance, a gallery opening. Was the killer selecting his victims from these gatherings? James decided to go undercover, attending these events in hopes of spotting someone suspicious, someone who might be the Shadows puppet. But as he immersed himself in this world, he couldn't shake off the feeling that he was being watched, that the hunter might soon become the hunted. The days following my discovery were a blur. I spent hours at the precinct, poring over old newspapers and records, searching for any mention of the solar eclipse and the tragic accident. The more I dug, the more the pieces began to fit together. It was a story that had almost been forgotten by the town. Many years ago, during a rare solar eclipse, a school bus filled with children had crashed near the woods. The accident was horrific, with many lives lost. The survivors spoke of seeing strange shadows moving just before the crash, but their accounts were dismissed as trauma-induced hallucinations. The town had tried to move on, but the legend persisted. Whispers of shadows that came to life during an eclipse, seeking revenge for some ancient wrong. It was the stuff of campfire tales and ghost stories, but now, I couldn't help but wonder if there was some truth to it. I found an old photograph of the survivors of the crash. As I looked at their young faces, a chilling realization dawned on me. The victims of the Shadows puppet were all in that photograph. They were the children who had survived the crash, now adults, and they were being targeted one by one. The weight of the revelation was crushing. The next solar eclipse was just days away, and I knew that the killer would strike again. But why? What was the connection between the shadows, the eclipse, and the accident? I decided to visit one of the survivors, Mrs. Thompson, an elderly woman who lived on the outskirts of town. She welcomed me into her home, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and sadness. As I spoke to her about the accident, she grew increasingly agitated. The shadows. They were real, she whispered, her voice trembling. They blamed us for the accident, for disturbing their sacred ground. They vowed to take their revenge, one soul at a time. I left Mrs. Thompson's house with more questions than answers. But one thing was clear, I had to stop the killer before the eclipse, before more lives were lost. The shadows might be controlling him, but I was determined to cut the strings. The days leading up to the eclipse were a blur of preparation and anxiety. I knew that the killer would strike again, and I had to be ready. Using the information I had gathered, I set a trap at the site of the old accident, hoping to lure the killer out of the shadows. As the day of the eclipse arrived, the town was filled with a palpable tension. People stayed indoors, fearing the return of the shadows and the killer they controlled. But I had a job to do. I positioned myself at the site, waiting for nightfall and the killer's inevitable appearance. The sky darkened as the eclipse began, casting the world into an eerie twilight. And then, just as I had anticipated, he emerged from the shadows. The Shadows puppet, as the town had come to call him. He approached me slowly, his eyes filled with a mix of madness and determination. "You shouldn't be here, detective," he hissed. "The shadows demand a sacrifice, and you will be it." We clashed in a brutal showdown, our struggle echoing in the silent night. But I had the advantage of preparation and determination on my side. After what felt like hours, I managed to overpower him, pinning him to the ground as the first rays of the sun began to pierce the darkness. The eclipse ended, and with it, the shadows that had controlled the killer receded. The town was safe once more. As I looked down at the defeated killer, I felt a mix of relief and sadness. Another monster had been stopped, but at what cost? The following days were a whirlwind of police reports and media attention. The town hailed me as a hero, but I felt no joy in the accolades. The memories of my family's loss and the horrors I had witnessed weighed heavily on my heart. I decided to retire from the force, seeking peace and solace away from the darkness that had plagued my life. The town would always be my home, but I needed to find a new path, one filled with light and hope. And so, as I packed up my belongings and prepared to leave, I looked back at the town one last time, grateful for the memories but ready to move on. The shadows may have been banished, but their legacy would always remain. And I would carry that legacy with me, a reminder of the darkness that lurks just beneath the surface and the light that can overcome it.